Hello everyone, I wish you a good day. Here are the main contents in the video. The seismic pivot in the order to liberate the world's throat. President Donald Trump unexpectedly flipped the strategic script by announcing that the US and Iran have reached a historic firing threshold agreement. The announcement to lift the blockade at the Strait of Hormuz not only shook the global energy market, but also pushed the entire Middle Eastern chessboard in a field of power restructuring full of storms and uncertainties. The gunshot that ended peace in the deep rift between the White House and the ABI. At the moment when the US-Iran agreement enters a critical phase, Israel's devastating bombing raid targeting Beirut's capital has infuriated the Pentagon over the unilateral military action of its close ally. Is this legitimate Israeli self-defense or something else? The five-point agreement is controversial and a shrewd strategic gamble by Iran. Despite absolute secrecy from the White House, Iranian media has exposed 5 key terms in the Memorandum of Understanding. This reveals an extremely sophisticated peace maneuver by Tehran's strategists to buy time through the US election season. Can Commander-in-Chief Donald Trump force Iran to completely abandon nuclear weapons in order to claim the diplomatic crown? Will the two countries get trapped in this long-term war of wits while over 5,000 American troops remain in the Gulf? Here are the details and analysis of the shocking news. The US and Iran have unexpectedly reached a historic ceasefire agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump continues to plunge into the center of the diplomatic storm as he heads to France to attend the G7 summit. This is a life-and-death arena where the US, Europe, and China are lining up for a strategic competition that will shape the era. Every decision, every handshake at this G7 summit carries immense weight, with the potential to reshape the entire structure of global power for decades to come. And a real political earthquake struck right before the summit began, overturning all the calculations of both allies and rivals. President Donald Trump unexpectedly announced that Washington and Tehran had reached a memorandum of understanding after many long days standing on the brink of war. This is just the opening shot for a risky diplomatic gamble aimed at cooling down the Middle East firestorm. In the digital space, the message from the American president rang out like a decisive order, officially announcing the complete reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and the lifting of the US Navy blockade, calling on ships worldwide to restart their engines so that the flow of oil could be restored. This statement immediately dealt a heavy blow to the global energy market because everyone understands that the Strait of Hormuz is the choke point, the lifeline of global trade, where even a small disturbance can cause the entire global supply chain to collapse. However, beneath the symbolic optimism that Mr. Trump deliberately created on his birthday to make his mark on history, diplomatic observers remain full of skepticism. The current document reflects only a consensus in principle among the parties. And from this first step to the official signing ceremony expected to take place in Switzerland 5 days later, there is a whole stretch of time filled with unpredictable variables. The drama reached its peak when Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif of Pakistan confirmed an agreement aimed at peace and ending military actions on multiple fronts, including the war-torn land of Lebanon. However, the parties' interpretations of the agreement differed greatly, revealing the fragility of this peace. While Washington and Islamabad called this a peace agreement aimed at regional stability, Iranian national media painted a completely opposite picture. Iran declared that standing firm forced the US to accept concessions after intense pressure, further cementing its inviolable strategic position in the Middle East. Iran's confidence was further demonstrated by the move of its Supreme National Security Council, preparing to issue an official statement. At the same time, Tehran decided to cooperate with Oman to directly manage and supervise maritime traffic in the Persian Gulf in the Strait of Hormuz. This action hits the Pentagon's most sensitive nerve, turning the waters, which have always been a strategic collision point between the US and Iran, into a powder keg ready to explode, completely reshaping the geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East and creating a new arena full of storms and challenges. From a strategic realist perspective, Tehran's announcement of cooperating with Oman to control the Strait of Hormuz immediately put the maritime powers on red alert. If interpreted according to the most extreme scenario, this action is no different from Iran unilaterally setting up a military checkpoint, seizing the power of life and death over the oil lifeline of the entire global economy. Management here likely just means supervising traffic and ensuring compliance with international maritime law. A clever diplomatic solution for Iran to both maintain national dignity, affirm its position as a regional power, and not sever the extremely fragile de-escalation process. because just one miscalculation, a provocative approach by speedboats, or a drone from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard like in the past, could immediately reignite the flames of war in this Gulf region. Amid the storm of doubts, President Donald Trump appeared on Fox News and confidently declared that the historic peace process was approaching the finish line, even though he himself had to admit that both sides had only signed non-binding agreements. Immediately, veteran host Laura Ingraham poured cold water on that optimism by recalling the bitter precedent. Iran has repeatedly withdrawn from negotiations at the last minute. The tough question being raised is whether the rain of bombs that the Israeli Air Force just dropped on Hezbollah positions in Beirut, Lebanon, will become a critical variable that destroys all of Washington's diplomatic efforts. Before entering the studio, Mr. Trump erupted in anger over the unilateral military action by Israel. Because the Commander-in-Chief of the United States directly called Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to express his sharp dissatisfaction when Israel chose this sensitive time to take military action, instead of prioritizing stability and paving the way for the U.S.-Iran agreement. The rift within the alliance became even more apparent when Mr. Trump publicly criticized on social media that the incident in Beirut was an unnecessary mistake. This bitter reality exposes a tragic scene of wartime diplomacy, as even in the midst of conflict, hardliners on both sides are still desperately trying to crush any chance of peace before it can even begin. For Israel's war cabinet, the best strategy is to make full use of their overwhelming advantage in military technology to crush and put absolute pressure on Iran. But Washington is playing a longer-term and more macro-level game than that. The White House is not just looking at immediate military objectives. They have to balance interests with the Arab bloc, consider the stability of global energy prices, and especially the shadow of new extremist terrorist organizations that could rise from the ashes if the Middle East sinks into a prolonged all-out war. Strategists at the Pentagon fully understand that a campaign to completely destroy the Iranian state will never create a pro-American government. On the contrary, it would turn this country into a second Syria or Iraq, a lawless land torn apart by civil war and a fertile ground for extremism. For that reason, President Donald Trump's strategy is aimed at a pragmatic order, containing conflict, securing vital maritime routes, and re-establishing the regional balance of power, instead of being dragged into a bloody crusade with Tehran. On the other hand, from Tel Aviv's perspective, the ultimate goal is to permanently strip Iran of its ability to threaten the security of the Jewish state. For them, whether Iran later falls into chaos, becomes unstable, or becomes radicalized is not something Israel is concerned about. They only need to remove the immediate threat. The strategic divergence between the U.S. and Israel is the clearest evidence that, even as close allies, America's national interests remain paramount and are not entirely aligned with Tel Aviv's ambitions. Even though Mr. Trump always affirms Israel's absolute right to self-defense, he cannot accept Tel Aviv using a minor explosion, which did not cause serious casualties from Hezbollah, as a pretext to trigger a large-scale military retaliation that would collapse the entire U.S.-Israel negotiation table at such a critical moment. The Middle East is being pushed to a boiling point by the cunning maneuvers of hardliners on both sides of the conflict. On the other side, hardline forces within Hezbollah and Israel are also taking advantage of minor border skirmishes as bait, deliberately provoking a brutal counterattack from Israel to undermine the détente between Tehran and Washington. After the Beirut airstrike, Iran's Tasnim news agency urgently announced all flights in the country's west were canceled. This is a sign that Tehran has put its air defense systems on the highest state of combat readiness, preparing for the worst-case scenario. Amidst that tense situation, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, a key figure in Iran's power structure, suddenly poured fuel on the fire by declaring that continuing to sit at the negotiating table with Washington at this time is completely meaningless. This is a tough dilemma that President Donald Trump has to solve, as peace is just one step away, but the abyss of war is right beneath his feet. The dramatic tension of this diplomatic game lies in the fact that the person directly holding Iran's fate at the negotiating table is Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, a politician with a hardline stance, a seasoned figure who has held high-ranking command positions within the ranks of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. His presence turns the negotiation room into a battlefield without gunfire, but full of dangers. If Washington applies too much pressure, the hardliners in Tehran are ready to slam the table and walk out, pushing both countries back to the starting point of hostility. On the other hand, if the White House appears too soft and makes concessions, Donald Trump will immediately face political storms from key ally Israel and other allied forces in the region. That is the greatest tragedy facing American strategists. They not only have to deal with the stubbornness of their opponents, but also have to restrain the hotheads among their closest allies. On one side are the warmongers who want to fan the flames of conflict to resolve everything by force, while on the other side is Washington, trying to preserve a stable, long-term strategic structure for the entire Middle East. Amidst the tense, implicit statements, the official stance from the Israeli Prime Minister's office carries a much softer and more positive diplomatic tone. After the high-level phone call between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Donald Trump, the Israeli side confirmed that Mr. Netanyahu highly appreciated the strong commitment of the American commander-in-chief to the survival and security of Israel. At the same time, the Israeli leadership still hopes that the agreement will be able to restrain both Tehran's nuclear ambitions and its long-range strategic military activities. This move proves that even Israel at its most hardline deeply understands that establishing a sustainable containment mechanism through diplomacy is still a less bloody and less risky solution than throwing the entire Middle East into an endless all-out war. So far, the specific contents of the memorandum are being kept tightly under wraps by President Donald Trump at the White House. However, the flow of information has started to leak from the other side when Iranian media began to reveal the first hidden details. The Isfahan news agency, citing the strategic advisor to the Tehran delegation, has revealed 5 key provisions in the draft peace agreement. When comparing these 5 key points with the recent suggestive statements of Mr. Trump, geopolitical observers noticed a startling alignment, indicating that the gears of history have begun to turn. The first provision lays the foundation by completely ending hostile actions and ensuring regional security. Tehran firmly demands that all military operations targeting Iranian territory, as well as the sovereignty of Lebanon, must be immediately suspended, accompanied by legal commitments from the U.S. to prevent any recurrence in the future. The focus of the second provision strikes directly at the economic lifeline by stipulating the release of Iran's massive frozen assets in international banks, while gradually lifting layers of sanctions to restore trade and oil export activities. The third provision broadens trade and navigation freedom, letting international vessels freely access Iran's commercial ports. This is vital for Tehran because easing the blockade not only saves its struggling economy, but also helps them rebuild strategic supply chains that have long been choked. The fourth provision is also the most sensitive and controversial part of the entire Iran nuclear agreement. According to the roadmap set by Tehran, the tough rounds of negotiations over the nuclear program will only be triggered after the U.S. completes lifting the blockade and easing economic sanctions. This is clearly a calculated move by Iranian strategists to buy time and shift the situation in their favor. With the implementation period starting 60 days from the official signing ceremony in Switzerland, this process will theoretically last until the end of August. However, all clear-headed geopolitical experts agree that Iran can easily use delaying tactics to prolong several rounds of additional negotiations. If that scenario happens, these negotiations will be pushed right up to the time when the U.S. midterm elections enter their most intense phase. The hardliners in Tehran believe that when Washington is caught up in the whirlwind of a domestic election season, the White House will be tied up and unable to make large-scale military decisions or reimpose strict sanctions. During that golden period, Iran will take advantage of every day to rebuild its economy, revive its defense capabilities, and strengthen its paramilitary network in preparation for a new confrontation on the Middle East power chessboard. Because of these deep calculations, geopolitical observers all share the view that Tehran's ultimate strategy right now is to prolong time as much as possible. Iran is cleverly planting in Washington's mind the illusion that the denuclearization process is making positive progress. But in reality, they always keep fallback options ready to turn the situation around at the most advantageous moment for themselves. But power doesn't shift so easily in one direction. The strategic team around President Donald Trump is alert enough to recognize this tug-of-war game. Washington does not see this as a regular diplomatic agreement, but as a long-term battle of wits, a war of attrition in terms of willpower. If the Republican Party continues to hold on to its throne of control over Congress after the midterm elections, the strategic pressure that the U.S. places on Iran in the next phase will certainly be even more intense and brutal. Iran's supreme leader has introduced a major bargaining chip, the fifth condition, demanding sanctions be lifted and the economy rebuilt. This is the ultimate goal that Tehran has longed for after decades of struggling under the suffocating pressure of international sanctions. But ironically, this is also the most advanced weapon, the greatest leverage that Washington is holding tightly in its hands. The main focus will be on lifting the primary and secondary sanctions, which have acted as firewalls separating Iran's economy from the rest of the world. Up to this point, the leadership in Tehran remains very cautious and has not yet made a final decision on the entire consensus document. However, their public acknowledgement of having reached a common understanding with Washington is evidence that the confrontation has entered a substantive phase, shedding the superficial theatrics. Tehran is making every effort to portray a bold image, further asserting its status as an unyielding power in the face of the American superpower. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump poured cold water on the situation by stating that the actual terms remain secret and accusing the media of distorting and exaggerating the nature of the agreement. Because the U.S. president did not hesitate to publicly criticize the information coming from Tehran, while also issuing a stern warning demanding the other side to correct their media coverage. Mr. Trump said much of the information released by the other side differed from the documents discussed. A decades-long geopolitical battle of wits between two former enemies always involves each side shaping the truth to serve its own domestic political interests. If a truly historic signing ceremony is finalized in Switzerland, the curtain of secrecy will be lifted, revealing all the painful concessions made by the other side, as well as the strategic gains that Washington has achieved. Given the current situation, Mr. Trump's main goal is to stabilize the economy and prepare for the midterm elections. Once the bottleneck at the Strait of Hormuz is resolved, the global surge in oil prices will cool down, causing the specter of inflation in the U.S. to recede, a gift that couldn't be better for American voters in this decisive election year. However, the real risk for Mr. Trump lies in the nuclear gamble itself. If after all the compromises, Tehran still retains a significant capability to develop its nuclear program, Mr. Trump will face a wave of fierce criticism from the American political establishment. The deal will be criticized as just a reworked version of the Obama-era nuclear agreement. Therefore, the next 60 days of intense negotiations will be a crucial question. Can the U.S. completely break Tehran's ambition to possess nuclear weapons? If successful, this victory will be a crowning achievement for Donald Trump's foreign policy. In your opinion, will this agreement succeed, or will Tehran back out at the last minute?